Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving. Before we begin our story, let us go back 300 years to the late 1600s. In those years, one of the most famous men in the world was Captain William Kidd. Captain Kidd was a pirate. He sailed the seas, capturing any ships he found. He and his men took money from these ships. Captain Kidd hid this money in different places. Captain Kidd was captured by the English in Boston, Massachusetts, and executed in the year 1701. From that time on, people all over the world searched in many places for Captain Kidd's stolen money. The people who lived in Massachusetts in the 1700s believed Captain Kidd buried some of his treasure near Boston. Not far from Boston was a small river which ran into the Atlantic Ocean. An old story said that Captain Kidd had come up this river from the ocean. Then he buried his gold and silver and jewels under a big tree. The story said that this treasure was protected by the devil himself, who was a good friend of Captain Kidd. In the year 1727, a man named Tom Walker lived near this place. Tom Walker was not a pleasant man. In fact, he was very stingy. He loved only one thing: money. There was only one person worse than Tom. That was his wife. She was fierce in temper, loud of tongue, and strong of arm. She also loved money. Equally as stingy, Tom's wife hid away anything of value she could get her hands on. These two were so hungry for money that they even stole things from each other. They lived in a sad-looking house that stood alone and had an air of starvation. The trees were straggling, no smoke ever came from the chimney, no traveler stopped at the door. The horse, with his ribs showing, stood in a field of moss and dirt, which was also neglected. One day, Tom Walker was returning home and took what was considered as a shortcut through a dark forest. Like most shortcuts, it was an ill-chosen route. He walked slowly and carefully so that he would not fall into a pool of mud. At last, he reached a piece of dry ground. Tom sat down on a tree that had fallen. As he rested, he dug into the earth with a stick. He knew the story that Indians had killed prisoners here as sacrifices to the devil. But this did not trouble him. The only devil Tom was afraid of was his wife. Tom's stick hit something hard. He dug it out of the earth. It was a skull. In the skull was an Indian tomahawk. Suddenly, Tom heard an angry voice. "Don't touch that skull!" Tom looked up. He saw a giant man sitting on a broken tree. Tom had never seen such a man. He wore the clothes of an Indian. His skin was almost black and covered with ashes. His eyes were big and red. His hair stood up from his head. He carried a large axe. The giant asked, "What are you doing on my land?" But Tom Walker was not afraid. He answered, "What do you mean? This land belongs to Mr. Peabody." The strange man laughed and pointed to the tall trees. Tom saw that one of the trees had been cut by an axe. He looked more closely and saw that the name Peabody had been carved into the tree. Mr. Peabody was a man who got rich from stealing from the Indians. Then Tom looked at the other trees. Every one had the name of some rich, important man from Massachusetts. Tom looked at the tree on which he was sitting. It also had a name cut into it. The name of Absalom Crowninshield. Tom remembered that Mr. Crowninshield was a very rich man. People said he got his money as Captain Kidd did, by stealing ships. Suddenly the giant shouted, "Crowninshield is ready to be burned. I'm going to burn many trees this winter." Tom told the man that he had no right to cut Mr. Peabody's trees. The stranger laughed and said, "I have every right to cut these trees. This land belonged to me a long time before Englishmen came to Massachusetts. The Indians were here. Then you Englishmen killed the Indians. Now I show the Englishmen how to buy and sell slaves, and I teach their women how to be witches." Who are you, if I may be so bold?" asked Tom. "Oh, I go by various names. I am the wild huntsman in some countries, the black miner in others. In this neighborhood I am known by the name of the Black Woodsman," said the giant. Tom now knew that the giant was the devil himself, but Tom Walker was still not afraid. The giant said Captain Kidd had buried great treasures under the trees, but nobody could have them unless the giant permitted it. He said Tom could have these treasures, but Tom had to agree to give the giant what he demanded. Tom Walker loved money, but he asked for time to think. He needed proof that what the giant was telling him was true. Before Tom could blink, the man had disappeared. When Tom went home, he found the black print of a finger burnt into his forehead and was unable to wipe it away. He told his wife what had happened. She wanted Captain Kidd's treasure. She urged him to give the devil what he wanted. Tom said no. At last, Mrs. Walker decided to do what Tom refused to do. She put all her silver in a large apron and went to see the dark giant. 2 days passed. She did not return home. She was never seen again. Some people in the province say that the great black man with an axe on his shoulder was seen very late in the evening coming out of the swamp carrying a bundle tied in a checked apron. The most current and probable story is that Tom went to the place where he had met the giant. He began calling her name repeatedly, but she was nowhere to be seen. His attention was caught on a group of carrion crows hovering over a cypress tree with a vulture perched on one of the branches. Tom then noticed his wife's apron hanging in a tree. He was happy, mainly because he wanted to take her silver that she had left behind. But when he opened the cloth, there was no silver in it, only a heart and a liver. Tom was sorry he lost the silver, but not sorry he lost his wife. Actually, he wanted to thank the giant for doing him such a favor. And so, every day he looked for the giant. Tom finally decided that he would give the giant what he wanted in exchange for Captain Kidd's treasure. One night, Tom Walker met the giant and offered his soul in exchange for Captain Kidd's treasure. The devil now wanted more than that. He said that Tom would have to use the treasure to do the devil's work. He wanted Tom to buy a ship and bring slaves to America. As we have said, Tom Walker was a hard man who loved nothing but money, but even he could not agree to buy and sell human beings as slaves. He refused to do this. The devil said that his second most important work was lending money. The men who did this work for the devil forced poor people who borrowed money to pay back much more than they had received. Tom said he would like this kind of work. So, the devil gave him Captain Kidd's treasure. A few days later, Tom Walker was a lender of money in Boston. Everyone who needed help, and there were many who did, came to him. The needy and adventurous, the gambling speculator, the dreaming land jobber, the thriftless tradesman, the merchant with cracked credit. In short, everyone driven to raise money by desperate means and desperate sacrifices hurried to Tom Walker. Tom Walker soon became the richest man in Boston. When people were not able to pay him, He took away their farms, their horses, and their houses. He built himself a very large and elaborate house, but left the greater part of it unfinished and unfurnished because it would cost too much. He even set up a carriage made with the most beautiful material, though he nearly starved the horses which drew it. As he got older and richer, Tom began to worry. Having secured the good things of this world, he began to feel anxious about those of the next. What would happen when he died? He thought with regret of the bargain he had made with his black friend and promised himself to work to cheat him out of the conditions. Tom then became very religious. He went to church every week. He thought that if he prayed enough, he could escape from the devil. Tom did not want to be caught off guard. Therefore, it is said he always carried a small Bible in his coat pocket. He also had a large Bible on his office desk and would frequently be found reading it when people called on business. One day, Tom took the land of a man who had borrowed money. The poor man asked for more time to pay. "Please do not destroy me," he said. "You have already taken all of my money." Tom got angry and started to shout, "Let the devil take me if I have taken advantage of any money from you." That was the end of Tom Walker. For just then he heard 3 loud knocks. He opened the door. There was the black giant holding a black horse. The giant said, "Tom, I have come for you." Poor Tom had left his Bible at the bottom of his coat pocket and his big Bible on the desk buried under the mortgage he was about to foreclose. The black man whisked him up, gave the horse a lash, and away he galloped with Tom on his back in the midst of a thunderstorm. Nobody ever saw Tom Walker again. A farmer who lived on the border of the swamp reported that in the height of the storm he had heard a great clattering of hoofs and of howling along the road. He ran to the window and caught sight of a figure on a horse that galloped like mad across the fields, over the hills, and down into the black hemlock swamp toward the old Indian fort. After Tom Walker disappeared, the government decided to take Tom's property. But there was nothing to take. All the papers which showed that Tom owned land and houses were burned to ashes. His boxes of gold and silver had nothing in them but small pieces of wood. The wood came from newly cut trees. Tom's horses died, and his house suddenly burned to ashes.